Alrighty, so tonight we're going to talk about how liberalism dominates leftist discourse and organising here in Australia, and the way it impacts organisation and co-ops the struggle for liberation. We're going to talk about some real-world examples of how this is happening. First, though, we're going to discuss how liberalism manifests itself in our organisations, and we'll do a bit of an analysis on how liberalism dilutes radical movements and co-ops the struggle for liberation. Then we're going to look at some examples like identity politics, tokenism, etc. So before we go any further, just a quick recap of the last lesson. So we had a quick look at what liberalism is, where it originated, how it first came about, the fact that it's centered around individualism, that it's got strong emphasis on economic freedom, private property, and that it was a driving factor of the development of capitalism. And also that's how it's been used to justify colonialism across the world, and how ultimately it's not compatible with First Nations governance structures. Got a few questions for each little part of the class, though, to begin each part. So the first part's on the pervasive presence of liberalism. So we've got a few questions up on the slide here. If anybody wants to have a go at answering any of them, what do we mean when we say liberalism is pervasive? Have working class struggles always been liberal in nature? And has liberalism infected the revolutionary and radical movements in Australia?
I suppose I'd like to jump in first if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So liberalism being pervasive, I suppose, because we live in a liberal society, it is the kind of basis through which we kind of grow through, unless we have incredibly radical parents, I suppose. You're going to have to live with the majority of your material conditions suggesting that liberalism is the right way to be. And so it's really hard to disentangle what is liberalism from oneself to kind of, kill the cop in your mind, as it were, and move in the direction of radicalism and rid yourself as many of those liberal brainworms as you can.
Yeah, definitely. Now, does anybody else have anything they want to add on to that? There were some great points that you just brought up.
A pretty easy yes for the third question. I think that the taming of the union movement in Australia has liberalised it a lot, which has weakened leftist movements as a whole.
Yeah, 100%. Alrighty, we might move on to the next bit then. Liberalism is the dominant ideology of our society. It is the foundation of everything that we understand. It's the founding principles of government, the ideology of capitalism, and the political and moral philosophy of the West. It is the system of belief that underpins the education systems, that determines how stories are told in the media, that underpins how the government expresses and talks about itself. It manifests itself and permeates in every aspect of society because it is the dominant ideology. Now, what does this mean for revolutionary movements and radical circles? Ultimately, it means that liberalism is pervasive. However, revolutionary movements have not always traditionally been liberal. A major part of these movements across the globe comes from the tradition of workers' movements, of Marxism, socialism, anarchism. It comes from the tradition of liberation struggles across Africa, Asia, and occupied indigenous lands right across the world. These movements and struggles that were fighting against the very forces that adhere to liberal ideology, ultimately. So radical left circles in the world outside of the West are not liberal in nature, because liberalism is the ideology of the ruling class, and the working class movements of these oppressed and anti-colonial struggles have a different history. We have very different ideas and different theories, and in many ways, understanding this is a starting point to understanding what we mean when we say that liberalism is pervasive in leftist circles in the West. In Australia, we have to contend with the fact that the dominant ideology of the ruling class has infiltrated and infected our circles and our movements, and we have to figure out what to do about it if we are ever serious about achieving liberation on this continent. There is a few ways that liberalism manifests itself in reaction to revolutionary movements and energy. When there is a popular upswelling of energy, it can either be solidified into a confrontation with the system itself, or it can be co-opted and redirected back into the maintenance of the system. So liberalism does the latter. It co-opts those movements and redirects them back into the maintenance of the system, as opposed to challenging the system. As we go through the class tonight, we're going to discuss 5 primary ways that liberalism dominates radical discourse and our movements, and how it redirects energy back into maintaining the colonial capitalist system. These 5 main ways are identity politics, co-option by capitalism, reform rather than revolution, Ngoization, and the subversion of solidarity. So we are going to explain a bit more about what liberalism is and how it actually manifests as we go through this class, as well as in the next class. Moving on to the next topic, how liberalism dilutes radical movements and co-opts the struggle for liberation. We're going to look at identity politics now. Before we go any further though, does anybody want to have a crack at explaining either what identity politics are, or what intersectionality is, or what the difference between the two are?
So my understanding of intersectionality is the understanding of how, plus being disabled, it's understanding the struggles and how they multiply.
Yeah, definitely. All of those things. It's looking at the interconnected nature of social categorizations, such as what you're mentioning, like race, class, gender, etc. And looking at how they apply to a given individual or a group, regarding how it overlaps with other systems of oppression that are in place. By contrast, identity politics are a liberal approach to social and political activism that focus on specific identity-based struggles, such as what we were just saying, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. But it doesn't actually address the underlying capitalist and colonial structures that perpetuate these oppressions.
I'd also like to jump in quickly if I can as well.
Yeah.
With the identity politics, like another aspect, I suppose, to extend is that it is also competition-based in that, or it's siloed, I should say, I suppose, in that, like, if you're an environmentalist, you know what I mean, you do environmentalist action, but don't necessarily think about how that impacts, like, Indigenous communities, and how those things, if you don't take those things intersectionally, then it leads to more negative outcomes from people not actually seeing kind of the broader picture that intersectionality gives them.
Yeah, definitely.
The struggles that people go through in different classes are compounded by every different minority group they're a part of, such as being Black, plus being a woman, plus being queer.
Based on a particular identity, or
Why is that bad?
identity politics.
Yeah. Why is it bad?
Kieran will get to that, I think.
Yeah, I'm about to explain that now.
Yeah, why is identity politics bad, Kieran?
Yeah, we're about to get to that. Identity politics are bad. We're about to look at why. So first we have to, look at understanding intersecting oppressions and how that is crucial for building solidarity among diverse oppressed groups in the struggle against capitalism and against colonialism. Identity politics, though, are a Western liberal solution to intersectional oppression. Intersectionality was initially a concept within Black radical feminism, and it emphasized the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as, race, class, and gender. However, in some instances, this concept can be taken through a liberal framework, and in doing so, it loses its critique of the actual system. It reduces stuff down to identity. It focuses narrowly on individual experiences. It diverts attention away from those systemic issues that exist, and doesn't look at addressing overarching problems like capitalism and colonialism. Now, while identity politics, might aim to highlight marginalized voices, the emphasis on singular identities can quite often lead to internal divisions within movements, which ultimately, ends up hindering the solidarity necessary for effective resistance against these larger oppressive systems. So we need to instead, emphasize stuff like shared class interests and building class consciousness, because that's what's vital for uniting workers and oppressed people across different diverse identities to be able to actually challenge the capitalist colonial exploitation effectively. Identity politics, is also often co-opted by capitalism, where corporations and political parties will use identity-based messaging to sell products or gain electoral support. This sort of co-option often dilutes the radical potential of identity-based movements, and it redirects them towards market-driven solutions rather than systemic change, which is, one of the major problems here. So capitalism itself relies on divisions among the working class to be able to maintain its control and maximize its profits. It can exploit existing prejudices and hierarchies to create divided labour forces, which makes it essential to address both class and identity-based inequalities to be able to achieve proper social justice. Another major and prominent issue with identity politics is that it prioritizes form over substance. So identity politics has people platforming incorrect and harmful analysis because they come from someone of a marginalized identity, or they're, a favored celebrity, or they're from a well-known social media influencer, etc., based on their identity, not necessarily the substance of their politics. These people themselves are also platformed, not just their ideas, when we go and do this. And ultimately, these people are turned into leaders or regarded as radicals simply for being a member of a particular identity, as opposed to their ideology. So when people say that it's radical to exist as Indigenous in this world, that doesn't mean that every single Indigenous person holds coherent radical politics, as an example. And while it is easy to tell the difference between a conservative and a radical, if they're a white cis hetero person, it's not always easy for most people to tell the difference between a liberal and a radical, simply because of the very fact that liberalism co-opts this radical language and our movements. So we ultimately have to be really discerning. Identity politics work actively to attack and to undermine our revolutionary analysis, and people have identities with less social capital in the contemporary social justice spheres. Right, so ultimately, it's a type of sycophantism and it's parasitism, and it's rooted in individualism. At its core, identity politics undermines solidarity. It promotes cowardly and harmful politics. Ultimately, liberalism champions individual rights and freedoms. We have to remember here. So when we're looking at liberal identity politics, it's championing those individual rights and individual freedoms, as opposed to class struggle and collective rights and collective freedoms. Ultimately, we're not saying that it's of no importance to look at stuff intersectionally. It obviously is. It's something that, we definitely have to do. It's just we need to do it through a framework that isn't individualizing identities and reducing political struggle down to identity alone, instead of a struggle against the system, the capitalist system and the colonial system.
Can I add to that, Kieran, really quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
First of all, I want to say in terms of examples of that creation of racial animosity in workplaces and stuff, and how capitalists can co-opt that to use it against kind of people, and things like affirmative action, something that was in America where basically it said, we're going to have quotas to see how many kind of black and brown people we need to hire. That creates this tension within the workplace around kind of, black and brown people, you only got here because, we had that affirmative action stuff. And so something that from a white perspective, you're give them greater access to jobs. That sounds great. But ultimately, if you don't see intersectionality and from multiple perspectives, it actually turns out quite negative in action.
Yeah. And we're going to also touch on this in a few slides. But yeah, definitely about that whole sort of diversity hire approach to stuff, I suppose you could say. Alrighty. Up next is co-option by capitalism. So we're going to go back to identity politics. As I was just saying before, these things ultimately intertwine with each other as well. But can anyone give me an example of how revolutionary struggle is co-opted by capitalism?
In the queer community, the idea of pride being taken up by corporations and police marching with pride, when pride is supposed to be a revolutionary statement. It's supposed to be a statement of you can't control us, but it's just been co-opted into this rainbow nightmare.
A whole rainbow capitalism, as it's called.
I suppose the same goes for green capitalism as well. The idea that we could kind of green our way to a better capitalism with the human face kind of stuff. Even Che Guevara t-shirts.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Huge, a very visible example of capital absorbing revolutionary struggle.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess maybe to build off that example, I think of Hollywood movies that chart these kind of quote unquote revolutionary stories, like Judas and the Black Messiah. I remember the rapper No Name refusing to be on the soundtrack because they're taking Fred Hampton's story and taking all the Maoism out, taking all the radicalism out and turning it into a Hollywood money-making thing.
Yeah. There's examples pretty much right across the world from most, if not all, movements. Even here in Australia, You know, look at the Aboriginal flag. Look how co-opted that is and how much that's on, you know, all feel-good blackfellow merch everywhere, and it's even owned by the state. That flag started as a land rights protest symbol. And now it's owned by the very state we're protesting and flown above all their government buildings. They're the ones occupying our lands. Like, it's so many ironic examples of how revolutionary struggle is, their symbolism is co-opted. But yeah, we're going to talk about that in this next slide. Market-oriented approaches to social justice under the co-option of capitalism. So the liberal approach to social justice has increasingly adopted market-oriented strategies. The cornerstone of the liberal/market approach is this: if they can reduce it to mere symbolism, then they can co-opt it. Diversity and inclusion initiatives, while, you know, obviously opening doors for individuals from marginalized communities, are ultimately just token gestures. That is because these initiatives do not challenge foundational principles of capitalism. Integrating marginalized groups into existing structures without questioning the systemic inequalities inadvertently stabilizes the very system that the liberation movement seeks to overthrow. So this happens for a number of reasons, but mainly because first, it creates a false sense of potential. So individuals from oppressed minorities might think that they can achieve status within the capitalist class and that this leads to overall equality, even though, as we all know, all it does is continue the same systems of class division that exist within members of the majority. But this false sense of potential de-radicalizes and placates people. It's that whole, you know, temporarily embarrassed millionaire sort of trope where, you know, people are
Voting against their own interests?
Yeah, they're voting against their own interests because that's what they're identifying with, you know, the capitalist class, even though they're not a part of that capitalist class, because they might be one day. And, you know, by offering a few positions in the CEO boards to, you know, a couple of black followers or a couple of gay people, a couple of women, whatever it might be, then, you know, all of a sudden, hey, we better not go against the system because, you know, one day we might be able to become CEOs now that there's black CEOs and women CEOs, etc., etc. So that's one way that the market attempts to co-opt. It takes a market-oriented approach to social justice. Another way is that it creates members of the oppressed minority, by extension of the other one I was just mentioning. It creates members of that oppressed minority who will organically tend to actively work against movements that threaten the system in order to preserve this newfound social status that they might receive. So this has been seen right throughout history in every land that the British have colonized. They go in and they take a select few members of the local population. They give them special status or privileges over their fellow people. And in return, those people use that status and that privilege to reinforce the occupier's will and the occupier's prerogatives and their systems. And we still, you know, continue to see this even today. Members of the comprador bourgeoisie is ultimately, you know, their proper name. But there's many of them here in Australia selling out on the oppressed members of their own identity in order to further their own individual agendas and their own individual status and wealth. So on top of that, though, that's when it happens kind of organically. There's also a history of liberalism deliberately co-opting leaders and prominent figures through offering them these seats, I suppose you could say. So it occurs through various means. You know, there's offering positions of power, there's financial incentives, there's, you know, the offer of recognition within mainstream political or economic establishments. Once co-opted, though, these leaders always soften their rhetoric. They always compromise on key demands, and they always become less effective advocates for radical change because ultimately they become a part of that very system that they were originally trying to fight against. So yeah, so once your movement is corporate friendly, this is the way to look at it. Once your movement is corporate friendly, once it's endorsed by companies, that is how ultimately you know that you've lost any radical potential to demand something from the system or, you know, God forbid, to be able to actually threaten that system. We only have to look at the radical roots of, you know, the queer movement, for example, to see how far removed it is from the rainbow capitalism that we see existing today. Another way it happens is through the corporatization and capitalist co-option of our movements. It's something that is very much to be feared and warded against. It's something to be mindful of, and oftentimes This co-option is a conscious attempt by the state itself to try and destroy our movement. But just as often as it is a conscious attempt, it's very often an unconscious attempt, and it's an inevitable outcome of lack of proper political education amongst people, and disorganization and lack of a proper plan going forward. All right, there's a question in the chat. Do you think movements like Black separatism and lesbian separatism that are often based on creating safety from white people / men are a form of identity politics? It's a really great question. There is an answer already in the chat to that. It is, my take would be, what is the goal of those orgs? Is it purely safety or safety in organizing the destruction of capitalism? Both valid reasons, but to do the latter, these orgs will need to work with other orgs to create collective class consciousness. Yeah, perfect answer. But yeah, just to summarize as well, some examples are very much stuff like, the co-option of Che Guevara's image and how much that is used by, how much that's commercialized now and used by capitalism, as well as, many of these other symbols, as well as, offering people positions and places within the system itself to try and de-radicalize them and their movements. Well, that takes us to our next slide, which is reform rather than revolution. So first off, what is the major contradiction to reforms? Does anybody want to have a crack at answering this first question?
I'm gonna say because it's undialectical in that it doesn't actually resolve the contradiction of capitalism, because it's reform, not revolution, which results in synthesis, would be my take.
Yeah, perfect. How does liberalism, promote reform over revolution?
I think that it's in the interest of the liberal class to promise that, they can piece by piece be reformed to try and keep people from getting ideas. If you give people just enough, it keeps the working class bit nullified, I suppose.
Yep, that's definitely one way.
Would you also say by telling people that change comes from electoralism, which creates reform and can't create revolution?
Yeah, that's another big way. Yeah, alrighty. So liberal politics often seeks reform within the existing system, such as legal changes or policy adjustments. In contrast, we at the BPU advocate for revolutionary change, viewing capitalism as something that is inherently exploitive, and we advocate for the overthrow of that capitalist system in favour of a First Nations communal governance system. So one of the ways in which liberalism promotes reform over revolution is through the liberalisation of radical ideas. Liberalism dilutes radical movements by absorbing and watering down their ideas. So radical critiques of capitalism, imperialism, and systemic oppression can be incorporated into liberal discourse in a more softer and palatable form. Now, while this might, help to raise awareness of certain issues that might not be discussed in the mainstream, what it ultimately does is strips away the more profound structural critiques and solutions that radical movements propose. So another way is that it leads, ultimately, like this itself also leads to another way, one of the ways in which liberalism can dilute radical movements, which is by changing the discourse to a preference for incremental change and reform within existing systems. Electoralism, for example, funneling people into electoralism and into trying to reform that system through being a part of it. So liberals often advocate for working within the established political and economic structures to achieve this gradual progress. Now, while this approach may lead to important reforms and improvements, it will be at odds with the more transformative goals of radical movements. So by emphasizing moderation and compromise, liberalism ultimately discourages more radical and revolutionary actions. And ultimately, it can never actually truly challenge the underlying forces that cause and perpetuate oppression and exploitation, that being the capitalist economics and the liberal politics themselves. So in the end, it leads to a preservation of the status quo and maintaining those existing power structures by offering partial concessions and gradual reforms. It also seeks to appease discontent that might exist without fundamentally challenging that established order that is causing that discontent. It focuses on incremental reformism to pacify that public demand for change, leading ultimately to complacency and the delay of urgency and any substantive action against that entrenched oppression, which in the end just further perpetuates the oppression rather than dismantling it. So up next is the NGOization of social justice. So a few quick questions here. First off, has anybody ever worked for an NGO and has any experience of what's good and bad about working within an NGO and what some of the issues might be and whether they've been helpful or harmful to revolutionary movements? And even if you haven't worked for an NGO, does anybody else maybe know some of the issues with NGOs or want to have a crack at saying whether they're something that's helpful or harmful to revolutionary movement?
I volunteered at Vinnie's for multiple years, which wasn't working, but I feel like, yeah, I guess some of the problems is that it's very like capitalism based, which obviously, in this world, people need money and it's good to be able to donate money to people in order for them to be able to live. And I think that mutual aid, including financial mutual aid, is a really wonderful thing, but that's not what charities do. A lot of the time they just make more money for the charity, and also they get to decide who the money goes to. So it's not about feeding everyone, it's about only feeding some people, or like feeding an addict if they've been sober for a certain amount of time. And it's no, everyone should get food no matter what. Yeah, and they just have like so much power over things, especially with how many of them are religious and how much like discrimination against LGBT and other, and not that LGBT is religious, LGBT and religions that aren't Catholic that we've seen happen in these organizations. Yeah, they have a lot of power over the people that they're meant to be helping, and often don't really help them or only help them in a certain way.
Yeah, 100% everything you just said is a lot of the major problems. And cheers for sharing as well. Yeah, and all the stuff in the chat as well. There's a lot of great stuff in the chat, like talking about how NGOs are tokenistic, checklist, government funded, full of white feminists, how their entire manager level were full of middle-class white people who were completely disconnected. Stories about giving them the wrong materials, such as types of clothes to communities who don't wear that style of clothing, etc., as well as the other issues around their goals and agendas, which we are going to touch on the next slide. But yeah, so the NGOization of social justice refers to the transformation of grassroots social justice movements into professionalized, institutionalized, and often depoliticized entities, primarily in the form of non-government organizations or NGOs. So this phenomenon has become prevalent worldwide, particularly in the global south, where NGOs play a significant role in addressing the various social, economic, and political issues that might be present. Initially, NGOs emerged as vital actors filling gaps in public services and advocating for marginalized communities. However, over time, they have faced fair criticism for several reasons. First off is the professionalization. So NGOs, in their efforts to secure funding and to gain legitimacy, have become increasingly professionalized. This professionalization often involves hiring experts and specialists, which creates a disconnect between the organization and the grassroots people that they're supposed to support. As a result, the authenticity, the relatability of that movement's objectives become compromised. Professionalization also prioritizes organizational stability over the radical goals of social justice movements, diluting the transformative potential of grassroots activism within that broader NGOization phenomenon. Another way is through bureaucratization. So NGOs, just like bureaucratic institutions, are bound by rules, regulations, and donor requirements. So as organizations grow, they often adopt hierarchical decision-making processes and standardized procedures, which mirror traditional bureaucratic systems. Now, while this evolution can enhance organizational efficiency, this bureaucracy stifles the flexibility and spontaneity that grassroots movements often rely on. Bureaucratic structures can create barriers between leadership and the grassroots, hindering direct community engagement. And moreover, the emphasis on paperwork and compliance can divert energy and resources away from addressing the root causes of social issues, potentially diluting the radical goals that inspired the movement in the first place. So the bureaucratization of NGOs, while providing stability, can inadvertently erode the organic, community-driven essence of social justice movements. Decision-making processes become slow, they become top-down, they reduce the agency of local communities, and ultimately NGOs become another bureaucratic entity, too heavily limited by processes and red tape to actually enact any tangible support. Another real big way is their dependency on donors. So NGOs heavily depend on funding from governments and international organizations, as well as private donors. This reliance itself ends up shaping their agendas in accordance to the preferences of the funders. It diverts attention away from critical grassroots issues, and instead it focuses all that attention on those donors because of that need for sustainable funding. So what happens is NGOs have to prioritize projects that are attractive to donors rather than prioritizing and addressing the actual root causes of social injustice. On top of that, many donors, such as government, for example, place restrictions not only on what the funding can be used for, but how it can be used as well as restrictions on stuff like outward political messaging that the NGO might put out into the community. That dependency on donors in itself leads to depoliticization. So as NGOs navigate through that complex landscape of looking for funding, they often have to avoid explicitly political or radical stances. This depoliticalization ends up diluting the transformative potential of social justice movements. Emphasizing technical solutions and apolitical approaches ends up overlooking the structural issues of capitalism, of colonialism, and of the other power dynamics that underlie social injustices. And finally, another flaw of NGOization of social justice is the marginalization of activists and organizers. So through that professionalization that we were talking about before of activism and of organizing, NGOs inevitably marginalize grassroots organizers. Those directly affected by social injustices often find their voices will be overshadowed by these professional staff who in themselves are often, educated elites, and the people who are leading these organizations are quite often, upper middle class. Consequently, the lived experiences and that nuance of understanding of local issues from that ground level ends up getting lost. Even if the NGO starts off grassroots, or even if the individuals at the top grew up experiencing oppression themselves, ultimately those who work for these NGOs at these high positions often end up losing sight of what was once their interests, and this happens because their own interest and their own stance within their own status within society ends up changing. And there's plenty of examples of this, not just within the sphere of NGOs, but there is plenty of examples of people who grew up poor, grew up oppressed, or grew up experiencing all sorts of horrendous things, only to themselves turn around and seek out a seat at the table with the oppressor. There's a great quote, when education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And quite often we see this all the time in society. Perfect example is look at Albanese. Apparently he grew up in public housing, and now look what he's doing to public housing. His own single mother that raised him in public housing would not be eligible for a house today under the laws that Labor governments have brought in, under the direction of people like Albanese. So it's just a factor to bear in mind, I suppose. Just in summary, that whole NGOization of social justice encapsulates the transformation of vibrant grassroots movements into institutionalized professional organizations. And yes, NGOs may play essential roles in service delivery and advocacy, but this process causes contradictions regarding their authenticity, through bureaucracy, through their dependency, through their depoliticalization, and their marginalization.
I just wanted to add in something. If
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys recall, but it was 4 years ago. It was during the Morrison regime, I think. They were trying to pass legislation that would so that if NGOs had employees that were involved in sort of radical actions or political resistance, that those NGOs would either lose or like there'd be some sort of like their registration or some sort of consequence for the actions of their employees. I don't know if you guys recall it, but it didn't get through. But that's the kind of thing the Liberal Party and that were trying to do to NGOs.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if that end up going through or not. I know that very similar rules apply to charities. So if you've got like a charity status, for example, you can't, be critical of government policy. Otherwise, they can withdraw your charity status.
Yeah, maybe it went through in some form, but it didn't. It wasn't. It was quite extreme what they were trying to get through.
Yeah.
But
yeah, like this is ultimately like what we're talking about here. This whole nature of liberalism and how it attempts to like co-opt and de-radicalize even reformist organizations like NGOs.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a question in the chat as well. The question is, I think about professional staff in unions. In my opinion, they are best viewed as kind of admin/support/secretarial staff. In order to allow members to still be working in their industries or organizing at a member first level. What is your feeling on this? Good question. Oh, the professionalization of organizing work. Yeah. Look, it really is a fine line, hey, because on the one hand, there is advantages to having, staff who have the skills and qualifications that are needed to be able to, do all the business end side of stuff and all the, behind the scenes stuff. On the other hand, though, it does present with that contradiction of, to what point are those people still representative and, knowledgeable about the struggles of the people that they're meant to be representing in the first place? So yeah, it's a really fine line to kind of balance. I suppose ultimately, I don't have the best answer for you, I'm afraid. It's not something not in the union field anyways, that I've really considered all that much. Ultimately, you would want those positions to be filled by people who have both the skills to do the task, but are also a part of that grassroots struggle. So, I suppose like when we look at the BPU, for example, we've got, members in similar sort of like, I suppose you could say professional staff positions, like, stuff like secretaries, treasurers, and, people who help write up our education classes and whatever else and stuff. But they're still very much connected to that grassroots struggle and members of the grassroots, themselves. They're not people who have come from a upper middle class professionalization sort of background. And I suppose more so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about professionalization. We're referring more so to the fact that quite often a lot of the people that do have these skills and these experience and these qualifications would come from a class that was privy to that sort of education in the lead up to be able to get there in the first place. Not everybody can go to law school, for example. Not everybody can, go out and, learn all that needs to be learned about accounting, whatever else and stuff. But it's a tough one. And like this is, ultimately like what we're trying to also navigate with these classes. Like how do we move forward through this landscape? So yeah, Tam, Clem, and Brendan, you've brought up a good point about how, they should be from rank and file members, rotating and bound by collective democratic decision making, not by the top-down union bureaucracy that they are currently. Definitely agree with that. That's, definitely a good way to look at it. And yeah, that's another great point that's being brought up as well about how people view union work as a stepping stone to becoming a politician or, into politics itself. It is something that, does need to be navigated ultimately. And it's something that there isn't really any straightforward, cut clear answer to in and of itself, where that answer won't have any drawbacks as well. It's really a situation where, any approach we take is going to have its positives and its negatives. And it's just about identifying those positives and negatives, weighing them up and looking at what approach works best and how can we try and mitigate some of those negatives in the meantime. But we might move on to the next slide if that's it for that. I think there's another maybe 3 slides or so, and then we'll be wrapping up. All right, so up next, we're going to be looking at subversion of solidarity. So what is solidarity? And what are some things that undermine solidarity amongst organisers and in between organisations?
I guess solidarity is recognizing the ties between us as oppressed class under capitalism, as workers, as people who don't own the means of production.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess acting in a way that is not necessarily in your own personal interest, but in the interests of others within your class, or even outside of your class, just in as far as standing with them.
Yeah, definitely solidarity as well. So what are some other things that we haven't already mentioned that might undermine solidarity?
Identity politics.
Yep, identity politics. Picket scabs is in the chat. Anyone else? Otherwise, we can move on to the next part of this.
I guess I'll say something real quick. In my experience, I think what's really undermines solidarity, is that people are too gun ho just to support X, Y, Z. It could be LGBT rights, black rights, or even environment rights, for example. I think people just get too gun ho, oh, I need to support this because I think this is detrimental to people that are feeling affected by this, that they don't take the time to actually listen. They're just too gun ho to say, I support this, I'm in solidarity, but they don't take the time to actually listen to people that are feeling these oppression, pain, and hurt. I think that can undermine solidarity to organizers and organizations, just from my point of view.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very important point, and I hope everybody was listening and heard that. That is something that we see all the time. People in their rush to try and display their solidarity take a very paternalistic approach to our politics and to providing us support, and ultimately it's not solidarity at all. Move to the next bit and talk about it a bit more. So everything that we've just discussed over this last however long it's been now in the lesson undermines solidarity, and it makes it harder to maintain a strong collective. But to expand on this point a little bit further, we can look at solidarity and working class struggle as an example. So while critical of identity politics, we also stress the importance of intersectionality and building solidarity across identity lines within the working class. So recognizing our shared struggle against a common oppressive system can only help to strengthen the struggle against both class-based and identity-based oppression. Liberalism works to undermine this in a variety of ways. First off, through its marginalization of radical elements. So liberalism can marginalize the most radical elements within a movement by presenting them as extremists, or as troublemakers, or as uncompromising people who have just got to stick up their ass, all sorts of ways. So liberal narratives will favor these moderate voices. Not these ones. They will favor more moderate voices that are more willing to compromise and work within these established institutions. This marginalization can limit the influence of radicals, and it can redirect the movement towards less confrontational and less transformative goals. The pervasive power of identity politics, cancel culture, and various forms of social capital create an environment where individuals, are too afraid to speak out in support of radical people and too scared to promote or platform revolutionary leaders who others might not find palatable. Another way is through individualism. So we won't go into this too much because we've discussed it a lot, especially in the first class. But in essence, liberalism can undermine the solidarity of radical movements by promoting individualism and a focus on personal success instead of collective success. So the emphasis on individual rights and freedoms diverts attention away from collective struggles and away from class-based analysis, weakening the unity of radical movements. The fear I was just speaking out in that last point as well, about speaking out in support of revolutionary people, is also a form of individualism, as ultimately it undermines the solidarity needed to hold together a collective liberation movement. Another big one is language policing and cancel culture. So language policing and cancel culture have emerged with liberal discourses as mechanisms to create safer spaces. Now, there is nothing wrong with this in and of itself. However, these practices can often have negative ends or negative consequences depending on the way that they're employed. So, you know, they can be taken to extremes, for example, to character assassinate individuals and encourage marginalization of groups and organizations by groups that might have harmful politics or agendas themselves, such as liberals denouncing revolutionary political groups as being authoritarian or violent, or, you know, supporting genocide, blah, blah, blah. Language policing as well, as cancel culture, can also lead to a stifling of proper, genuine debate and education. So now, obviously, I'm not saying that we should be, you know, I'm not talking about like slurs and derogatory language and whatever else and stuff. You know, I'm not talking about harmful language and saying that we should be able to use that whenever we like, but rather we need to look at the overemphasis on language policing that exists, and that leads to a prioritization of linguistic correctness over actual meaningful dialogue. So yes, you know, we need to look at how it's discouraging open conversations with both our comrades as well as the broader working class in general about more complex issues. So cancel culture, you know, while it was originally meant to hold people accountable, it can sometimes result in the shunning of individuals who could have been potentially educated and brought into transformative discussions, and it hinders the growth of our movements. It's also often weaponized for personal agendas as well within political movements, which in itself undermines solidarity and promotes harmful behavior. So at least within our own movements, we should seek to hold each other accountable in a way which is cohesive and respectful rather than damaging and harmful, if that makes sense.
I guess this just makes me think of a conversation that Freya and I had the other night about the Rainbow Coalition with the Black Panthers in Chicago back in the, I think, 60s and 70s, which was like this idea of like building solidarity across identity lines, where you've got people from like different class backgrounds, different racialized backgrounds coming together and like fighting a common enemy. And I think like that kind of alliance building is really hard to imagine in like a world where liberalism and that kind of liberal identity politics is so dominant.
Yeah, 100%.
I had one point on subversion of solidarity. It also happens when on social media and on other places, there are lots of accounts and media platforms individual people that are funded by the reactionary elements in the ruling class, and they create the impression that although there are shared interests among people around the world, that in actual fact, people only dislike each other. For example, there would be one person, let's say from India or Pakistan somewhere, and they will express an anti-Black view. And then because of to the degree that people have been dehumanized, it seems as if there is no individual self to any person and everyone thinks the same. And then it depoliticizes solidarity and de-radicalizes people thinking they don't have any support from that place, even though that identity of the person who said it might not even be their real identity. It might be a psychological oppression done by the ruling class across the media platforms.
Yeah, definitely. And cheers for that contribution, Abhijit. All right, so we're going to move into a discussion section. Before anybody bails though, if anybody wants to head off, that is the end of this class bit. But we're going to have our next part in a fortnight at the same time on this same link. In the next class, we'll be looking specifically at how to combat liberalism within ourselves and within our own organizing spaces. We're now going to have a bit of a yarn though. If anybody, has got any longer questions or points they want to bring up from earlier, or, other random stuff that they've, might want to bring up or contribute or talk about, now is your opportunity.